Don't be dramatic. Pack your bags and learn to live on your own, my daughter-in-law said at the dinner table, exactly 1 week after we buried my son. I remember the way the words settled into the room, not loudly, not with anger, but with a kind of calm certainty that made them feel final. The dining room still smelled faintly of the lilies from Daniel's funeral, their sweetness turning sour as they wilted in a vase no one had bothered to move. His chair sat empty at the head of the table, untouched, as if we were all pretending he might walk back in at any moment and tell us this had all been some terrible mistake. But no one spoke his name anymore. Not Ashley. Not even the silence between us. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, my fingers resting against each other as if they belonged to someone else. At 71, I had lived long enough to recognize when something was ending. What I hadn't expected was that it would be my place, in my own family. Ashley didn't look at me when she said it. She kept her eyes on her plate, cutting into her chicken with slow, precise movements, as if she were discussing something as ordinary as the weather. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't soften. It carried no trace of sympathy for the woman who had just lost her only child. Across from her, my grandson's chair was empty too. He had been sent upstairs early. "It's better this way," she had said. Better for whom? She hadn't explained. I waited. Not for an apology. Not for a correction. Just a pause. Perhaps. A breath. Where someone might remember who I was. But the moment passed, and nothing followed. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in a house that suddenly no longer felt like mine. I glanced at Daniel's chair again. I could almost see him there, leaning back slightly, giving me that small, reassuring smile he used to offer whenever conversations grew tense. "Mom, this is your home," he had told me once, years ago, when Ashley had first moved in and everything began to shift in quiet, almost invisible ways. I had believed him then. I had believed that no matter how life changed, some things remained steady, permanent, safe. But now the words felt like something fragile I had dropped and couldn't piece back together. "You'll be better off somewhere smaller," Ashley continued, finally lifting her eyes to meet mine, though there was no warmth in them. "This house is too much for you now." Too much. I had managed this home for over 3 decades. Every corner of it carried the weight of a memory. The kitchen, where Daniel used to sit at the counter doing his homework. The hallway, where I had measured his height each year, small pencil marks still faintly visible if you knew where to look. The living room, where we had spent holidays, birthdays, quiet Sunday afternoons. "Too much," she said, as if all of that could be reduced to square footage and utility bills. I nodded once, slowly, because it seemed like the only movement my body would allow. My voice, when it came, was steady. "I see." And I did. Not all at once, not clearly, but enough to understand that something had been decided long before this dinner, something I had not been part of. Ashley returned her attention to her plate, satisfied, as if a task had been completed. There was no discussion, no negotiation, just a conclusion delivered in the same tone one might use to close a meeting. I remained seated for a few seconds longer, listening to the quiet sounds of cutlery against porcelain, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the distant creak of the house settling into the evening. Then I stood. My chair made a soft sound against the hardwood floor, the only sign that anything had shifted at all. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. I walked out of the dining room without another word, leaving behind the table, the empty chair, and the life I had spent decades building, already understanding in a way I could not yet fully explain that this was only the beginning of what they thought would be the end of me. The house sounded different that night, as if it had already begun to forget me. I stood in the hallway outside my bedroom for a long time, my hand resting lightly against the wall where the paint had worn smooth over the years from passing footsteps. I used to walk this same path every morning, heading toward the kitchen to make Daniel his coffee before he left for work. The same routine repeated so many times, it had become part of the house itself. Now the hallway felt longer, quieter, like a place that no longer recognized the person moving through it. I stepped into the bedroom slowly, almost expecting something to stop me, some invisible boundary that had been drawn while I sat at that dinner table. But nothing did. The room was exactly as I had left it that morning. The bed neatly made, the curtains pulled halfway open to let in the fading light. On the dresser, Daniel's photograph stood in its silver frame, the one taken 5 years ago at the lake. He was smiling in that easy way of his, one hand resting casually on his hip, the other shielding his eyes from the sun. I walked over and picked it up, holding it carefully as if it might break. "You told me this would always be my home," I said quietly, though my voice did not carry far in the empty room. The words did not echo. They simply settled into the silence and disappeared. I placed the photo back exactly where it had been, aligning the frame with the edge of the dresser the way I always did. Small habits, the kind that make a place feel stable, predictable. I opened the closet and looked at my clothes hanging there in neat rows, each piece chosen over the years for practical reasons rather than style. Sweaters for winter, light blouses for summer, a navy coat I had worn to church every Sunday for as long as I could remember. Nothing about them suggested urgency. Nothing about them said 2 weeks. That was what Ashley had given me. 2 weeks to dismantle a life that had taken more than 30 years to build. I reached for a suitcase on the top shelf, but stopped before pulling it down. It felt too soon. Not because I did not understand what was expected of me, but because something inside me refused to move at the pace she had set. Instead, I closed the closet door gently and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped slightly beneath my weight, a familiar sensation that brought a strange kind of comfort. This bed had held years of ordinary nights, conversations that drifted into silence, the quiet rhythm of breathing beside me, and now only stillness. Downstairs, I could hear faint movement, the clink of dishes being cleared, the low murmur of Ashley's voice on the phone, though I could not make out the words. She sounded calm, organized, as if everything was proceeding exactly as planned. I realized then that this moment, this quiet unraveling of my life, was not sudden for her. It had been considered, arranged, perhaps even rehearsed. The thought did not make me angry, not yet. It settled somewhere deeper than that, in a place where understanding begins before emotion catches up. I leaned back slightly, resting my hands on either side of me, and looked around the room again. Every object held a memory, but the memories themselves felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else's life. I wondered how long it would take for the house to erase me completely, for my presence to fade into something that could be explained away with a simple sentence. She moved out. It was for the best. I stood again after a while, smoothing my hands over the bedspread out of habit, even though there was no one left to notice. Then I turned off the light, leaving the room in soft shadow, and stepped back into the hallway. I did not rush. There was no need. Whatever was coming had already begun, and for the first time since that dinner, I understood that leaving was not the only thing that could happen next. I woke up before sunrise the next morning, not because I had rested, but because the house had grown too quiet to sleep in. For years, there had always been small sounds that filled the early hours, the hum of the coffee maker, the soft creak of Daniel moving through the kitchen, the low murmur of the morning news drifting from the television. Now there was nothing, just stillness pressing in from every corner. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the silence settle over me like a heavy blanket I could not push away. Then I sat up slowly and placed my feet on the floor, the wood cool against my skin. The routine remained, even if the meaning behind it had changed. I walked to the kitchen out of habit, measuring each step without thinking, as if my body still believed it belonged here. The kitchen looked exactly the same countertops, the same neatly arranged dishes, the same window above the sink that let in the pale morning light. But something was different in the way the space held itself, as if it had shifted slightly overnight. I reached for the coffee pot and prepared it the way I always had, careful, precise, following steps that had once been automatic. When the machine began to brew, the familiar sound filled the room, but it no longer felt comforting. It felt like an echo of something that had already ended. I poured a cup and set it on the table, then paused. For a moment, I almost reached for a second cup. My hand hovered in the air before I slowly lowered it. There was no one to drink it. I sat down at the table, wrapping my fingers around the warm ceramic, and looked toward the hallway that led to the front door. I used to watch Daniel leave from that exact spot, reminding him to drive safely, asking him about his plans for the day. He would always turn back, just for a second, and smile. That small gesture had meant more than I ever said out loud. Now the hallway remained empty, and the front door stayed closed.
After a while, I heard footsteps upstairs, light, deliberate, followed by the sound of a door opening and closing. Ashley. She moved through the house with a kind of quiet efficiency that I had once mistaken for confidence. Now I recognized it as something else: control. A few minutes later, she entered the kitchen, already dressed, her posture straight, her expression composed. She glanced at me briefly, then at the coffee pot, as if assessing the room rather than sharing it. "You should start sorting your things today," she said, her voice even, almost polite. "It will make everything easier." Easier. The word lingered in the air, hollow and vague. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because there was nothing to be gained from resistance. She opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, and closed the door without another word. No question of whether I had slept. No acknowledgement of the life that had just been broken apart in this very house. Just instructions. She checked her phone, her eyes scanning the screen quickly, then turned toward the door. "I will be out for most of the day," she added. "Try to have a plan by tonight." A plan. As if my life could be reduced to a list of tasks to complete before evening. I watched her leave, the sound of the front door closing behind her echoing softly through the house. When the silence returned, it felt heavier than before. I sat there for a long time, the coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at nothing in particular. Then, slowly, I stood up and walked toward the living room. The morning light had shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything looked familiar, but the familiarity no longer offered comfort. It felt like I was walking through a place that had already decided to forget me. I paused near the bookshelf, running my fingers lightly along the spines of the books Daniel had collected over the years. He used to tell me that a home was not just walls and furniture, but the stories we left behind in it. I wondered what story this house would tell once I was gone, or if it would tell anything at all. I turned away from the shelf and looked around the room one more time, not with sadness, but with a kind of quiet awareness that something had shifted inside me. This was no longer just about leaving. It was about understanding why I had been asked to go in the first place, and whether that answer was as simple as they wanted me to believe. It was not always like this, and that was the part that stayed with me the longest as I moved through the house that morning, touching things without really meaning to, letting my fingers rest on surfaces that had once been part of something whole. I stopped in the doorway of the den, where the sunlight came in at an angle Daniel used to complain about when it hit his eyes in the afternoon. He would sit there on the old leather chair, one leg crossed over the other, a book in his hand that he never seemed to finish because he was always too busy talking instead. "Mom, you should get better curtains," he used to say with a half smile, squinting toward the window. And I would laugh and tell him the light was good for the house, but it made everything feel alive. Back then, he would just shake his head and stand up to adjust the blinds himself, doing it carefully, like everything else he did. He had always been that way, thoughtful in small ways that were easy to miss if you were not paying attention. I walked further into the room and ran my hand along the back of the chair, feeling the worn edge where his arm used to rest. It was such a small detail, but it carried years of presence in it. That was how our life had been built, not on grand moments, but on quiet consistency. Morning coffee together before work, Sunday dinners that lasted longer than they needed to because neither of us wanted to end them, conversations that wandered from one subject to another without ever feeling rushed. When Ashley first came into Daniel's life, I welcomed her the same way I had welcomed everything else that mattered to him, with open hands and the assumption that what made him happy would naturally become part of my world too.
I remembered the first dinner we had together in this very house. She had complimented the food, smiled politely, asked questions that sounded right but never quite reached beyond the surface. At the time, I told myself she was just adjusting, that relationships take time to grow into something real. Daniel had looked at me across the table that night, his expression soft, almost hopeful, as if asking without words for my approval. I had given it freely. I had trusted that whatever changes came, the foundation between us would remain untouched. But as I stood there now, the memories began to shift, not changing, but revealing something I had not allowed myself to see before. The small moments when Ashley had redirected conversations, gently but firmly, steering Daniel away from me without making it obvious. The times when decisions were already made by the time I was told about them. The subtle way my role in the house had begun to shrink. Not all at once, but in increments so small they were easy to excuse. I had noticed, of course. Anyone would have. But I had chosen to interpret those changes as part of life moving forward, not as something being taken away. I stepped back from the chair and looked around the room again, this time not through the lens of memory, but with a clearer understanding of what had been happening beneath it. Nothing had been accidental. Not the distance, not the quiet exclusions, not even the calm certainty in Ashley's voice the night before. This had been building for longer than I had been willing to admit. And Daniel, somewhere along the way, had stopped correcting it. I did not know when that shift had happened or why. Perhaps he had believed it was easier to let things settle into a new shape than to challenge them. Perhaps he thought there would always be time to fix what felt slightly off. I would never have the chance to ask him. That realization settled into me with a weight that was different from grief, something steadier, more defined. I was not just mourning my son anymore. I was beginning to understand the life that had formed around him without me, quietly, carefully, until it no longer had space for who I had been. And for the first time since that dinner, I did not feel confused. I felt aware. I did not go looking for answers that day, but they began to reveal themselves anyway, not in dramatic ways, not in a single moment that changed everything, but in small details that no longer felt as innocent as they once had. I returned to the kitchen in the late afternoon, more out of habit than hunger, and noticed something I had overlooked that morning. The mail had been placed neatly on the counter, sorted into 2 small stacks. One for Ashley, one for what remained. I walked over slowly and picked up the thinner stack, my name written on only a single envelope, the rest addressed to her. That alone was not unusual. What caught my attention was the letterhead on the envelope in my hand. A law office. The same one that had handled Daniel's estate just days earlier. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the paper between my fingers, as if it carried more than just information. I had not expected anything more to come. Everything had been discussed, or at least everything had been presented as settled. I opened it carefully, not with urgency, but with a quiet sense that I was stepping into something I had not been meant to see too closely. The words were formal, precise, written in a tone that left no room for emotion. It referenced documentation, asset distribution, and a follow-up regarding final confirmations. My eyes moved slowly across each line, taking in phrases that sounded familiar, but felt different now that I was reading them alone. Then I noticed it. A reference number, tied to a document I had never seen. I read it again, more carefully this time, my mind beginning to focus in a way it had not since the funeral. I had been present at the reading. I had listened as everything was explained in a way that seemed complete. But this suggested there had been more, something separate, something not included in that room. I set the letter down on the counter and stood very still, letting the thought settle fully before reacting to it. The house remained quiet around me, unchanged, as if nothing significant had just shifted. I turned toward the small desk near the window where Daniel used to keep his paperwork organized. It was still there, though most of the drawers had been emptied in the past week. Ashley had said she was taking care of things, a phrase I had accepted at the time because it sounded responsible. Now it felt deliberate. I opened the top drawer and found it nearly bare, just a few pens and a notepad left behind. The second drawer held nothing at all. When I reached the bottom one, I hesitated for a brief moment, then pulled it open. Inside, pushed toward the back as if forgotten, was a single folder. Plain, unlabeled. I picked it up slowly, aware that whatever was inside it had not been meant for casual discovery. The papers within were neatly arranged, clipped together with care. Legal language filled the pages, dense and structured, but there were certain phrases that stood out immediately. Supplemental clause, protected allocation, conditional beneficiary. I did not need to understand every detail to grasp the meaning forming between the lines. This was not part of what had been presented to me. This was something additional, something separate. I read further, my hands steady now, my thoughts sharpening with each sentence. There were conditions attached, specific ones, language that suggested intention, foresight, even protection. My name appeared more than once, not in passing, but with purpose. I felt something shift inside me then. Not a surge of emotion, but a quiet alignment, as if pieces that had been scattered were beginning to fall into place. This was why things had felt incomplete, why Ashley had been so certain, so controlled, so ready to move forward without hesitation. She believed she had everything accounted for, everything secured. But this folder, this document, told a different story. I closed it carefully and held it in both hands for a moment, considering what it meant not just for what had already happened, but for what was about to. Then I placed it back exactly where I had found it, sliding it into the drawer with the same quiet precision. Nothing about the house had changed. The walls still stood. The light still moved across the floor in the same familiar patterns. But now I understood something I had not before. I had not been pushed out because there was nothing left for me. I had been pushed out because someone believed I would never look closely enough to realize there was. That evening, I prepared dinner the same way I always had, moving through the kitchen with a quiet sense of purpose that no longer came from routine, but from clarity. I measured each step, each motion, not out of habit, but because I understood now that every detail mattered. The house remained still around me, holding its breath in a way I had not noticed before, as if it too were waiting to see what I would do next. I set the table for two, just as I had done the night before, placing each plate with care, aligning the silverware, smoothing the edge of the tablecloth where it folded slightly at the corners. Nothing appeared different. Nothing suggested that anything had changed, and that was exactly how I intended it to be. When Ashley walked in later that evening, she paused for a brief moment in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room as if confirming that everything was proceeding according to her expectations. Her coat was draped neatly over her arm, her posture composed, her expression unreadable in the soft light above the table. "You have not started packing," she said, not as a question, but as an observation. I looked up from where I stood beside my chair and offered a small, measured nod. "I will begin tomorrow," I replied, my voice calm, steady, without resistance. It was the answer she wanted to hear. I could see it in the slight shift of her shoulders, the way she exhaled just enough to release whatever tension she had carried into the room. Control, once again, restored. She set her things down and took her seat without another word, reaching for her napkin, unfolding it with precise movements that mirrored her nature. For a while, we ate in silence. The sound of utensils against porcelain filled the space between us, a quiet rhythm that might have once felt ordinary, but now carried something else entirely. I watched her without appearing to, noting the small details I had overlooked before. The way she checked her phone between bites, the way her gaze never lingered in one place for too long, the way she avoided looking toward Daniel's chair altogether. It was not grief, it was calculation. After a few minutes, she set her fork down and looked at me directly. "I spoke with the realtor today," she said. "There is interest in the house. We should move quickly." "We." The word was placed carefully, as if to create the illusion of shared decision, though nothing about this had included me from the beginning. I nodded again, just enough to acknowledge the statement without engaging it. "That sounds efficient," I said. She seemed satisfied with that response, continuing as if everything had already been agreed upon. "The market is strong right now. It would be a waste to delay." A waste. I let the word settle, turning it over quietly in my mind. For her, this house had already been reduced to value, timing, opportunity. For me, it had been something else entirely. But I did not correct her. I did not challenge the assumption. Instead, I allowed the conversation to end there, giving her exactly what she expected: agreement without resistance, compliance without question. When the meal was finished, I stood and began clearing the table, stacking the plates with the same careful precision I had always used. Ashley remained seated for a moment longer, watching me with a faint expression of approval, as if I had finally accepted my role in the process she had set in motion. Then she rose, gathering her things, preparing to leave the room. "Tomorrow," she reminded me, her tone light, almost casual now. "It will be easier if you start early." I nodded once more, my back turned as I rinsed the dishes under warm water, the sound steady and controlled. "Of course," I said. I heard her footsteps move away, the soft click of her heels against the floor fading into the hallway, then the quiet closing of a door. When the house settled again into silence, I turned off the faucet and stood there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the sink. The reflection in the window showed a woman who looked exactly as she had the day before. The same posture, the same calm expression. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was observing it, measuring it, understanding it. They believed I was preparing to leave. They believed I had accepted the outcome they had arranged. And for now, I would let them believe that. Because sometimes the only way to see the full shape of a plan is to step back and allow it to unfold completely. And I had already decided that I would not interrupt theirs too soon. The next morning, I did exactly what she expected me to do. I brought down the suitcase from the top shelf of my closet, placing it carefully on the bed as if it belonged there. I opened it slowly, smoothing the lining with my hand before placing the first item inside. A sweater, folded neatly, just the way I had done for years. From the outside, it would have looked like acceptance, quiet compliance, a woman preparing to leave because she had nowhere else to go. But inside, something entirely different had taken shape. I was not packing to disappear. I was preparing to move with intention. Each item I chose carried a purpose now, not just memory. Documents first. Not the obvious ones, not the papers Ashley had already reviewed and set aside, but the ones that still held weight. Old statements, copies of deeds, insurance records Daniel had once asked me to keep just in case. I remembered how casually he had said it at the time, standing in the doorway of this same room, holding out a folder with a faint smile. "Mom, you are better at organizing this than I am." I had taken it without question, placing it in the back of my drawer, where it had remained untouched until now. I retrieved it carefully, flipping through the pages with steady hands, confirming what I had begun to understand the day before. There were connections here, references that aligned with the document I had found, details that had not been included in the version of events presented to me. I placed the folder at the bottom of the suitcase, beneath the clothes, hidden in a way that felt both natural and necessary. Then I continued packing, one item at a time, maintaining the appearance of someone following instructions. Downstairs, I could hear movement again, the familiar rhythm of Ashley's steps, the opening and closing of cabinets, the quiet hum of a life continuing without interruption. She was not concerned, not watching closely. That was her first mistake. After an hour, I closed the suitcase halfway, leaving it open enough to suggest I was not finished, then carried it into the hallway where it would be easily visible, a signal, progress being made. Then I returned to the bedroom and sat at the small desk near the window, pulling out a sheet of paper and a pen. I did not rush. I wrote down a name I had not thought about in years: Mr. Collins, the attorney who had worked with my late husband long before Daniel had taken over most of the family matters. He had always been thorough, quiet, the kind of man who noticed details others overlooked. I had not seen him at the recent meeting. At the time, I assumed it was because everything had already been arranged. Now I understood that assumption had been convenient for someone else. I picked up the phone and dialed the number slowly, listening to each ring as if it marked a step I had delayed for too long. When he answered, his voice was older than I remembered, but still steady. "This is Margaret Whitmore," I said, keeping my tone even, as if this were an ordinary call. There was a pause, just long enough to suggest recognition. "Mrs. Whitmore," he replied, and in those 2 words I heard something I had not heard in days. Respect, not pity, not dismissal. Recognition. "I believe I need to review something that may have been overlooked," I continued, choosing each word with care. I did not explain everything. Not yet. Silence followed on the other end for a moment, then a simple response. "I think that would be wise." We arranged to meet the following afternoon. No questions, no hesitation. When I hung up, I sat there for a while, the phone still in my hand, feeling the quiet shift of something settling into place. Not victory, not yet, but direction. I stood and walked back into the hallway, glancing briefly at the suitcase positioned where Ashley would see it when she returned. Everything appeared exactly as she expected. A woman preparing to leave, a timeline being followed, a plan unfolding smoothly. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of agreement, but of acknowledgement. They believed I was at the end of something, and I had just taken the first step toward proving that I was not. The following afternoon arrived without ceremony, the kind of quiet transition that would have gone unnoticed in another life. I left the house at exactly 1 o'clock, closing the front door behind me with the same care I had always used, as if I still belonged to the space I was stepping away from. The air outside felt different, sharper somehow, carrying the faint scent of early autumn, though I could not remember when the season had begun to change. I drove myself, keeping both hands steady on the wheel, following roads I had taken hundreds of times before without thinking. Today, every turn felt deliberate, measured. The law office had not changed. The same brick exterior, the same narrow parking lot, the same glass door with the firm's name etched across it in clean, precise lettering. I paused for a moment before stepping inside, not out of hesitation, but to let the moment settle fully. Then I opened the door and walked in. The receptionist looked up briefly, offering a polite smile, the kind given to someone expected. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her tone neutral, professional. I nodded once in acknowledgement and took a seat where she indicated, my posture straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. A few minutes later, Mr. Collins appeared in the doorway of his office. He looked older than I remembered, his hair more gray than before, his expression lined with years of quiet observation. But his eyes were the same, sharp, attentive. "Margaret," he said, not as a question, but as recognition. I stood and followed him into his office without speaking. The room carried the same familiar scent of paper and polished wood, a place where decisions were not made quickly, but carefully. He gestured for me to sit, then closed the door behind us with a soft, final click. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He studied me briefly, not with curiosity, but with understanding, as if he already knew this conversation had been a long time coming. "I assume you have found something," he said at last, his voice even. I reached into my bag and placed the folder on his desk, sliding it toward him without explanation. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the pages with practiced efficiency. I watched him as he read, noting the subtle shift in his expression, not surprise, but confirmation. When he finished, he closed the folder and rested his hand on top of it, his fingers still. "This was not included in the recent proceedings," he said, more to himself than to me. I did not respond. I did not need to. He looked up then, meeting my eyes directly. It should have been. The room remained quiet, but the silence was no longer empty. It carried weight now. Structure.
Daniel updated this shortly before his passing, he continued, his tone measured. It establishes a protected allocation, one that cannot be reassigned without your direct consent. It also places conditions on the sale of the property. I felt the words settle into place, each one confirming what I had already begun to understand. "Meaning?" I asked, my voice steady. He leaned back slightly in his chair, choosing his next words with care. "Meaning that the house cannot be sold without your approval, and any attempt to proceed without acknowledging this document would be legally problematic." He did not need to elaborate. The implication was clear. I nodded once, absorbing the information without outward reaction. "Was she aware of this?" I asked after a moment. Mr. Collins paused, considering. I cannot speak to what she was told, he said finally. But I can say this document was not presented during the reading. That suggests either oversight or omission. Omission. The word lingered between us, quiet but precise. I folded my hands together in my lap, not in uncertainty, but in resolution. What happens next? I asked. He studied me again, as if measuring not my situation, but my intent. That depends on how you wish to proceed, he replied. You are in a position of authority here, whether you have been led to believe that or not. Authority. It was not a word I had associated with myself in a long time, not in this house, not in this family. But hearing it now, stated plainly, without embellishment, shifted something into focus. I stood slowly, placing my hand lightly on the edge of his desk. I would like everything reviewed, I said, properly. He nodded once, a small, decisive gesture. Then we will begin immediately. I picked up my bag, leaving the folder with him, and turned toward the door. As I stepped back into the hallway, the air felt different than it had when I arrived. Not lighter, not easier, but clearer. Outside, the sky had shifted slightly, the light softer now as the afternoon moved forward. I walked to my car without rushing, my steps even, my thoughts no longer scattered. They believed I was preparing to leave quietly, that I would follow the path they had laid out without question. But as I opened the car door and sat down behind the wheel, I understood something with complete certainty. I was not leaving, not yet, and when I did, it would not be on their terms. I returned home just before sunset, the sky casting a soft golden light across the front of the house, as if nothing inside it had shifted at all. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not out of hesitation, but to let the quiet settle into something steady and clear. When I stepped inside, the house greeted me with the same stillness it had held all week, but this time it felt different. Not empty, not heavy, just quiet, as if it were waiting. Ashley was already there, standing in the living room with her phone in hand, her posture composed, her expression unreadable at first glance. She looked up as I entered, her eyes moving quickly to the suitcase I had left in the hallway earlier that morning. It was still there, exactly where she expected it to be. You made progress, she said, her tone neutral, almost approving. I nodded once, setting my bag down beside the chair as if nothing else had changed. I did, I replied, my voice calm, even. She studied me for a brief moment longer, as if trying to confirm that everything remained under her control. Then she shifted her attention back to her phone. I spoke with the realtor again, she said. They want to schedule a walkthrough tomorrow. It would be best if you were ready to leave by then. Ready to leave. The phrase landed differently now. Not as a command, not as a conclusion, just as a statement based on something she believed to be true. I walked past her slowly, moving into the kitchen, setting my hands lightly on the counter as I looked out the window. The light was fading now, the edges of the yard softening into shadow. For a moment, I said nothing. Then, without turning around, I spoke. That will not be necessary. The silence that followed was immediate. Noticeable. I could feel it shoved behind me before I even heard her move. I am sorry? Ashley said, her voice no longer as steady as it had been moments before. I turned then, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since that dinner. The house will not be listed, I said, each word measured, leaving no room for misunderstanding. She stared at me, her expression tightening slightly, as if trying to process what she had just heard. I do not think you understand, she began, her tone sharpening just enough to reveal the control she believed she still held. Everything has already been arranged. I nodded once, acknowledging the effort behind her statement, not the validity of it. Yes, I said quietly, that is what you believed. The room remained still, but something fundamental had shifted within it. The balance she had been relying on no longer existed. I reached into my bag and removed a single document, placing it on the counter between us with the same care I had used for everything else that day. She did not touch it immediately. Instead, she looked at me, searching for something she had not needed to look for before. Uncertainty. "You should read it," I said. She stepped forward then, slowly, picking up the paper with controlled movements that no longer felt as certain as they had the night before. Her eyes moved across the page, her expression changing, not dramatically, but enough. A tightening of her jaw, a pause where there had been none before. The room remained quiet as she read, the only sound the faint rustle of paper between her fingers. When she finished, she did not look up right away. She set the document down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the counter, as if that small act could restore order to something that had already shifted. "This was not presented," she said finally, her voice lower now, less certain. "No," I replied, "it was not." She looked up then, her gaze sharper, searching again for the version of me she had spoken to at that table. The one who nodded, the one who left without a word. But that version was no longer standing in front of her. "This changes things," she said, though it sounded less like a statement and more like a realization she had not prepared for. I held her gaze without raising my voice, without stepping closer, without needing to. "It clarifies them," I answered. The silence returned, but this time it did not belong to her. It settled between us evenly, no longer tilted in one direction. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, holding on to the edges of a plan that no longer fit the reality in front of her. I turned back toward the window, resting my hands lightly on the counter once more, the last light of the day fading into evening. Behind me, I could hear her take a step back, then another. The quiet shift of someone recalculating what comes next. I did not follow. I did not explain further. I did not need to, because for the first time since that dinner, I was not the one being asked to leave. And as the house settled into the night, I understood something with complete certainty. I had not lost my place here. I had simply been reminded of who had the right to decide it.